Hey, what is up? Thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you're new here, my name is Jenna, and if you're not new here, welcome back. I'm someone who loves colorful, bold, gothic, edgy, and or indie makeup, and recently I have also been on a C beauty kick. And for those of you that don't know, that stands for Chinese beauty or Chinese makeup brands. They have been coming out with such innovative products lately, these C beauty brands, and I am a little bit obsessed. I don't know if this is going to turn into a whole series. All I know is that I do have quite a few C beauty brands in my collection now, and I would like to give them all a dedicated video, at least, you know, one product per brand at least. But I'm a busy bee these days with work, and honestly, getting to sit down and film this video has been a long time in the making. I've done 4 looks with this palette that I'm going to talk about today, and that has taken way longer than I would have liked to build up 4 looks to talk about, because work is crazy, life is kind of crazy.
Several months later.
But we are here, so let's get into it. So this is the Sanguine Rose palette from Haggard, if you couldn't tell by the title of the video. And this is what it looks like on the inside. I love this color story. It's honestly much more versatile than I initially thought it was going to be. I'll go ahead and show you the 4 looks that I've done with this palette. And out of the 4 looks, I did film the process start to finish of me doing look number 1 and look number 4. Look number 4 being the one that is on today. It is super sparkly. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So if you want to see how I got this look and the first look that I showed you, then you will want to stay tuned for that. That will be at the end of this video. If you don't feel like watching the tutorials all the way through before you hear my thoughts on the palette, we can go ahead and just jump right into that for the people who are curious. So overall, I would rate this palette an 8 out of 10. And there's a few reasons for that. It's a pretty solid palette overall. A few things that are kind of up to personal preference, and a few things that are more so reflective of the performance and the experience I had with it. So the first thing is that there are 5 mattes and 2 shimmers. And for me, that's a lot of mattes. And none of the mattes dupe each other, like none of them even come close to duping each other. So it's not like any of the mattes are repetitive or unnecessary, or that, you know, the selection of mattes isn't well curated. That's not it. It's just the 2 shimmers in comparison, and they don't dupe each other either, but I just feel like maybe you could have used 1 more shimmer. I don't know what color I would even make it, so maybe I don't have any room to complain, so to speak, but I don't know, maybe a green shimmer or something to kind of match the mauvey andesite shade here. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't know if I am. But yeah, I don't know. I just felt like when I was doing my looks, I would have liked to have an inner corner highlight color other than the champagne shade, which is called Obscure Claret. I also don't know if I'm saying that right. I should have done my research before I started filming this. So yeah, that was just personal preference. I could have used another shimmer, maybe instead of the gray. I don't know. Although the gray with the pink and the mauve, that's another look you could do. Like, even though this is only 7 shades and I've already done 4 looks with the palette, I still can think of more looks that I could do with it. So when I say like this color story is inspiring and well curated, despite my matte versus shimmer preference, I still think that it's just such a well thought out palette, and there's so much you can do with it. And I really like all the looks that I did with the palette so far. I feel like they are all pretty different from each other, so that was great. As for the performance of the palette, I will say there is a lot of kick up from the mattes in this palette. And I am not someone that typically bothers, but I don't know if you'll be able to see, like, this Misty Forest shade. I have such a deep well in it because it's very, very loosely pressed. It's very soft, which makes it good for like blending out. So, you know, pros and cons, but there's definitely a lot of fallout. And this is a white palette, and it's got like a paper texture, so it kind of absorbs color and pigment. And like this shade here I've been using as a blush quite a bit, and you can see where it's kind of getting stained. So that is not ideal, but also it's not the end of the world. So that's why this palette is not a perfect 10, but it is pretty solid. I think despite how intense the mattes look and pick up on the brush, they're actually quite forgiving, quite user-friendly. And the green, I was especially curious how it would perform blended out because it is really, really intense. I picked that up from the first look that I did where I just packed it right on to my eye over a, you know, a slightly wet base, and it was dark, like it showed up true to pan when it was packed on. So I wanted to see like how intense would it be blended out. It actually blended out quite a lot. It almost overblends. You can salvage it, you can go back in and add some more, but you will want to be careful to not overblend because things could get muddy and you could lose some of that pigment. But even though I feel like I kind of overblended the green, I think it still gives depth, even just like at a fraction of its full power. So it can be softened or it can be built up. It's an interesting formula. Like, I don't know, it's so soft and it's so pigmented, and yet you could really go either way. Like you can go full intensity or you can go super soft, muted, blended, melted together. It's very interesting. I'm very glad that I picked this up. I picked up, by now I have the other two from this series. I don't know the name of the series, sorry about that, but it's the Abyssal Banshee palette and the Daughter of Satan palette. That was the last one that I added to my collection, and it had some similar colors to the Sanguine Rose. So we'll see. Well, I'll try to do a comparison, if not here, then probably on Instagram, and just compare any shades I think are similar. And then Haggard, in the time that I've been trying to put this video together, they actually came out with a new collection. That one, I don't know the name of either. The Scepter series, maybe? The Moon Scepter series? Or like Captive to Eternal Night or something. I'll name it or put a link to it. But they came out with another collection. It's a set of 3 palettes. There's like a blue and gold one. There's like a rosy burgundy with like a duochrome one. It reminds me a lot of one of the Pat McGrath palettes. I think Divine Rose. And then there's a neutral one with like black and gold. So I picked up the blue one because that one was calling to me, and I may eventually go back for the burgundy and rosy one too, because that one's really pretty, especially the shifty shades in it. So we'll see, but I think my plan is to do a video using at least the palette from the new collection, just to kind of like compare on their journey, like how's the newer palette compared to this palette. I'm gonna be doing looks with all of them on my Instagram because it's much less time intensive for me to just, you know, take my silly little pictures and write my little caption and hit post. But ideally, I will be doing a series on here about all the Sea Beauty stuff that I've got and all the Sea Beauty stuff that I have used. I would like to build up a playlist, but we will see. We'll see how intensive that playlist is. But for now, I'm definitely having a good time. This was the first Sea Beauty brand that I dipped into, so I'm excited to go on this journey. Let me know what you think of this color story. Have you tried Haggard? Have you heard of them? Do you want to try them? I'd love to know your thoughts. And also let me know which look was your favorite, because, you know, I'm curious. I'd just like to know. And if you are sticking around for the tutorial bits, here we go! So starting out, I used a Danessa Myricks Color Fix as my base for this look because I wanted to create a very defined shape and I wanted a wet base for the shadows to really grip onto. And I used a flat brush, kind of using the edges of it to create the sharp fine lines towards the wing of the shape, and then the actual flat part of the brush on the broader parts of the shape. And 99% of the time when you see me creating an eye look like this, where it's a gradient of mattes and it's in a pretty defined big wing shape, this is the technique that I use because I just find that it's easier to get the precision that I want if I map out the shape first with a very visible base. So now on a smaller flat packing brush, I'm first going in with the shade Lost Lepidoptera. I think it might be misspelled in the palette because it's spelled without the R in it, but when I googled how to pronounce what's printed in the palette, there's only a spelling with an R in it. So I'm sorry if I mispronounced it or if I got it wrong, but it's the deep cranberry matte. And I think it applied very nicely. It was pretty pigmented off the bat and it blended out just by me kind of tapping the edges out and dragging outward. I do think that one of my eyes set before the other one did just a little bit, the base kind of dried up a tad, so that caused a little bit of problems later on, but I was pretty pleased with how this first shade applied. Then on a different flat packing brush, I took the shade Devil Fruit, which is a nice bright pink matte, and I started to blend that into the previous shade. And I'm just speeding through this part because my hand was in the way for most of me applying it to that eye, so sorry about that. But here you can see a better view of what's going on. I think the shade blended into Lost Lepidoptera pretty well, and it applied pretty pigmented, just like the first shade did. The mattes in general in this palette are a very soft, loosely pressed formula, which I mentioned in my little Cliff Notes spiel at the beginning of the video. So there was definitely no shortage of pigmentation when I was doing all of this look, really. I did have a little bit of trouble initially applying this next shade, Andesite. I think it was because I tried to reuse the same brush that I had just been using and I cleaned it off and I think there might have been some residue on it. So I switched brushes and that seemed to make a difference. I think it needed a little bit more of a stiff brush and just a clean brush that wasn't wet from me trying to clean it off and switch colors. That was also when I started to notice that one of my eyes was a little bit drier in the base than the other one, so that could have been part of the issue too. So after applying that Andesite shade, I went in with the same kind of brush. It is a different individual brush, but it is the same kind because it's a duplicate. And I went in with the shade Abyss, which is the matte gray in the palette. And this shade and Andesite kind of compete with each other. They're pretty similar in depth, so I was kind of struggling throughout the look to keep them from overpowering each other because I really wanted there to be a distinction between the two colors, but also have there be a smooth transition. So that was a little tricky. And again, my camera awareness was a little off here, so I apologize, but I'm just working on the other eye and trying to make sure again that the placement of the colors on both eyes are symmetrical or as symmetrical as possible. And by that I mean both how far extended the colors are, but also the level of depth or like darkness, if that makes sense. And then on my tiniest flat packing brush, I have the shade Misty Forest, which is a gorgeous dark green. And I could tell that the shade was going to be really pigmented, so I went in with a light hand to begin with, but my base on both eyes now had pretty much dried completely, so it wasn't as tacky, so I decided to go back in a little bit more heavy-handed, and that was my reaction to the difference a couple seconds ago that you saw, where I was nodding and thinking to myself, yes, that is about what I expected. And although I was able to push the pigment around, honestly, a bit more than I thought I was going to be able to, I did end up dipping back into the palette a couple more times just to make sure that the very edge of the wing shape was fully saturated the way that the rest of the placement of the green shadow was where I started. And that is pretty typical because when I'm creating a big wing shape like this with a sticky base, I drag out the product the most and create the thinnest part of that layer at the edge of the wing, so there's less product to grip onto the shadow. And now just doing the other side and making sure that everything matches up and everything is as pigmented as possible. I'm still using that really tiny packing brush that I love. I like to hold the tip of it perpendicular to the surface of my skin, so that way I can get even more precision, even though it is already so tiny. But that does give me even more control when I'm trying to fill in the very teeny tiny corner of my big wing shape. So here is where I kind of started to fixate a bit on making sure that the blend was smooth and symmetrical on both eyes. I went back in with the shade Devil Fruit, and I don't remember why I did this, to be honest. I think that looked fine. But in doing so, I ended up covering up the Andesite shade and some of the Abyss shade. So I went back in with more Abyss and tried to build that back up, because even though the shades are bright or even straight up light for some of them, they are pretty opaque and they will cover each other up and kind of try to compete if you're not careful. And here is the perfect example of that, because I felt like I wanted to put back in more of that Andesite shade, and it ended up covering up the depth that I had just worked to build back up with the Abyss shade. And this is the approximate moment where I have the realization dawn on me that I may have made a mistake with that decision. But don't worry, you can always go back in and go back over things. So I added more of the Abyss shade and I tried to smooth out the blend once again without losing the Andesite shade. So once I had finished blending to my heart's content, I went in with a makeup wipe and I wiped away the bottom edge of the wing to kind of crisp up the shape. And I also wiped away any fallout that the whole packing eyeshadow onto my lid process might have created, which honestly there wasn't a ton of fallout. I might have misspoken in my Cliff's Notes spiel at the beginning of the video when I was talking about the kick-up in the palette. I think I called it fallout one time, but there really wasn't a ton of fallout with this palette, but there was a lot of kick-up in the eyeshadow pan. But anywho, after crisping up the edges of my big wing shape, I went in with my actual winged liner on my lash line. And for this look, I used one of my Glisten Cosmetics wet liners in the shade Old Fashioned. And again, my hand was in the way on my one eye, so here's a better view of what's going on. I'm using a pointed liner brush. I wouldn't say it's super thin, but it's not really very thick either. And I am just kind of dragging and doing short strokes. That's how I like to do my winged liner usually. I don't really do one long stroke because I don't have the confidence for that. But anyway, I'm doing little short strokes, and I like to start on my actual lash line and then extend out to the actual wing part, and then kind of go back in and connect everything and smooth out that whole line. And I also thought that this particular shade of the Glisten wet liner could use another layer. So after finishing the winged liner and putting on some foundation, I'm now working on my lower lash line, and I got a flat angled brush and I'm just kind of stamping that pigment on my bottom eyelids. And I'm starting with the shade Misty Forest, but I will eventually dip into more colors to kind of reflect the same gradient that I did on my top lid. But for now, I'm just focusing on that first color. Going in now with a pencil brush, I've picked up the shade Abyss, and I'm starting to drag that towards the inner corners of my eyes. And then I'll be cleaning off my brush and following that shade with the shade Devil Fruit, which is again that super bright pink matte. Now I'm just doing some finishing touches, adding a little bit more of the shade Abyss. Moving on now to the inner corner highlight. We're almost done with this look. I've got a little bit of the namesake shade from the palette, Sanguine Rose, and I'm just tapping it onto my inner corner. It's super bright and super pretty, but it was a little bit too dark, so I went over it with some of the shade Obscure Claret. And after finishing the eyes, I put on the rest of my face makeup and I changed into a cuter little outfit. And this is what the finished look is. On to the next. Starting this time with the Prelusion Eye Base from Divina Cosmetics. I'm tapping that on with my fingers. This is what I use when I'm not using a overly sticky base for a look where I'm gonna pat on a lot of eyeshadows. Because as you can see, this is a more blended out, diffused look. I first went in with the shade Andesite on a fluffy brush, and I'm just buffing that in, really making sure that it's diffused. And I wanted to see how well I could build up the pigment. It is on the lighter side, it's pretty similar to my skin tone, but I just wanted to see how dark I could get it. Now going in on a fluffier brush with a rounded edge instead of the flat edge that I started with, I'm going to be taking the shade Abyss again, and I'm going to be deepening up the look just a little bit more. And I really just wanted to take my time with this look. When I'm doing something that's more blown out, I try not to rush things and I try to get things as seamless as possible. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know I do not like harsh lines when I'm trying to do a blown out look like this, so I try to just let the process take as long as it takes. I want to say that this look in particular probably took me about 35-40 minutes to do. I want to try to provide a time estimate of how long things take me when I'm, showing things at like 2 times speed in a video, just so you can get an idea of how long it actually takes, because I figure that's probably a good compromise, because I don't think anybody wants to watch me blend for 10 minutes, but I will tell you if I ever have to blend for 10 minutes or however long it may take. And I think part of why this look took as long as it did was also because I was once again trying to get the andesite shade to show up as much as possible, and putting it next to the abyss shade isn't the best idea when that's your goal, because the abyss shade is similar but darker, so they just compete with each other, and I've learned that since working with this palette, but I was just trying to get the andesite shade to show up a bit more. And after I was content with this kind of transitional blend we had going on, I dipped into Misty Forest on a more dense but still fluffy kind of brush. And I first started with more of like a tapping motion on the outer V part of my eye before I went into the windshield wiper motion, working the pigment into my actual crease. And then once I had the overall shape how I liked it, I started to buff out the edges and get rid of, you guessed it, that harsh line that I had created. And like I mentioned before, I wanted there to kind of be a distinction between the colors that I used in this look. I still wanted them to transition smoothly, but I wanted you to still be able to see all of them as much as possible. So I used pretty small motions while blending the green out, just because I didn't want to drag it up too far and overpower the colors that I had just laid down previously. And as cautious as I was about that, I still ended up needing to go back in with more andesite because it is just such a delicate shade, apparently. So after building that shade back up and just finalizing the blend, I moved over to the other eye and I repeated the same process. And for some reason on my left eye, which is the right eye as you're looking at it, I have a fold on my left eyelid that I don't have on my right eyelid, and it causes me such problems where I think that I've built it up to the same depth level, and depending on how the light is hitting it, I could be wrong. It's very hard to tell. My eyelid topography is just not the same. My eyelids are adopted sisters. They are not twins. So it takes me a minute. That's probably another reason why this eye look took, like 35-40 minutes, because I'd be struggling. But that's okay, because if you saw the beginning of the video, then you'll know that, spoiler alert, this look turned out okay, and we got there eventually. But here you're about to see what I'm talking about, hopefully. There's a little spot on my left eyelid that just doesn't want to grab pigment. And I mean like ever. It's not because of a particular formula or anything. Like, I can't even blame this eyeshadow palette in particular. It's just the way my eyelid is. That's why I have to raise my eyebrows to the high heavens when I'm blending so that I can get all the excess skin out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. But that's probably not a good long-term solution, but it's all I got right now. There are much bigger problems in the world anyway. So, back to the topic at hand. I'm going in one more time with my big fluffy brush and doing one final pass over with more, you guessed it, andesite. Just making sure that the blend is as seamless as we can possibly get it, even with our wonky little eyelid. And after we're finally done blending out the crease and laying down all the mattes, it's time to go in with some glitter primer to prime for those shimmers. Or really, I guess I should say shimmer singular, because we are just using Obscure Claret all over the eyelid. And I'm once again using a finger application because that is how I prefer to apply all of my sparkly shades. So after we've got the shimmer applied to both eyes and we stop to take a little break to admire the sparkliness, we're gonna do some winged liner. Typically when I'm doing just plain black winged liner, I like to use a liner pen from Uoma Beauty, but that one finally ran out. It had a good run, but I didn't have that on hand, so I'm using one from Deadly Sins Cosmetics. This one seems more of a felt type applicator than whatever the Uoma Beauty one is. I just know it felt different, so there was kind of a learning curve when doing my liner. I did try to get as much of it on camera as I could, because I know a lot of people have asked me to show how I do my winged liner, so hopefully this is helpful. I kind of was not aware of where the camera was again. I apologize. I do have a viewfinder now for future videos, so hopefully I won't run into that issue again. But basically, I'm using the same technique that I was with the water activated liner in my first look that I did, and I'm just doing short strokes and gradually connecting it all and bringing it all out to a point. And in this look, I also had to pay particular attention to the line on my actual lash line, because the sparkly shade on my lid, it is fairly textured, and I don't think that the felt tipped applicator really was the best option to line over a texture like that, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to make sure that that line was as straight as possible, even though I was lining over a slightly textured surface. So I'm just gonna finish up the other wing, and unfortunately I forgot to get footage of me finishing up my bottom lid and my inner corner. So I used Andesite as my inner corner highlight shade, and I used Misty Forest on my lower lash line. So that is what the full look looks like up close. Let me know which look was your favorite, and I hope you have a great day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is where you are. And thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.